Well, howdy everyone. Welcome to Texas A&M's Virtual Earth Month, here with Texas A&M University. And this is also in conjunction with TRACS, which is the Texas Regional Alliance for Campus Sustainability. So our university with universities across the state have events happening all month. And if you want to see our events, you can see on the screen right now. Just go to our website, sustainability.tamu.edu, and you can see a list of all of the events that we have for you. So just a little small piece of housekeeping for today is if you're looking at your screen and you see like where it's sharing, it probably says my name, Ben Kelscher screen. And if you click on the options on the right, you can drag it down to go to side-by-side mode. And that way, when we're speaking, we'll be on the side of your screen and it won't impact your ability to view the PowerPoint. So that's something that you can try out. And the other thing is that while we're giving this presentation, if you have questions that come up, I would ask for you to put any questions that you might have in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, I will collate those and I will ask our presenter any of the questions that you might have. With us today, we have Jessica Bomar. She is a political science major. She is the class of 2023, and she is going to be talking to you about homelessness and how that has been impacted due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I guess I should also say that this is the first in a series of talks by Office of Sustainability student interns. These are the sustainability talks, and what they're going to be doing is looking at different sustainability challenges and connecting those to the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jessica. She's going to start to share her screen and she's going to take it away.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Jessica Bomar, like Benjamin said. Allow me to open my screen here. So I'm an intern for the Office of Sustainability, and so when we hear the word sustainability, what often comes to mind first is environmental sustainability, but most importantly, what sometimes is forgotten is that social and political reform is considered a form of social sustainability as well, that intersects with the
Jessica, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It looks like your screen's not sharing yet.
Yes, here, one second. Can you enable screen sharing, Benjamin?
Oh, I'm sorry, you should have. I'm not sure why you're not already a host. All right. Sorry for this, y'all. We had practiced this and everything. You'd figure we'd have it figured out. All right, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Jessica. Take it away. I'll be quiet now.
Okay, so what's most important, and is sometimes forgotten when we think about sustainability, is the social and political ramifications that come from sustainability, that social sustainable aspect of that. So in particular, the environmental impacts that might disproportionately target certain communities over others. So I want y'all to keep this in mind as I begin to address what we refer to as the housing crisis in the United States. As you'll come to learn later, this is a bit of a misnomer. It's more accurate to say that we have an ethical housing crisis here in the United States, wherein access to housing is not equally attainable or affordable to all people or guaranteed as a human right. We will touch on the history of the United States, first to explain how we got to where we are, how the coronavirus pandemic could change it, and what we can do about it legislatively and in our local communities. So I want to open up with some quick facts about homelessness and poverty in the United States. So obviously, given Zoom, we can't interact very much, but I want to give you a second to kind of guesstimate as to how many people you think might be or are homeless in the United States. This could be a percentage, a rough number, whatever it may be. I'll give you a second to think. Okay, so currently, as of, I believe, 2018, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, there are about 553,000 homeless people as of 2018. That's roughly 17 out of every 10,000 individuals. So the U.S. housing crisis is a long history of understanding the position of for-profit housing motivations at odds with the human right to shelter in a post-industrial revolution society. To understand homelessness and poverty in America now, it's important to understand the history that created the current material conditions, so I will touch on this quickly. But first, I wanted to define some essential terminology that I will be using going forward. You may already know these terms. If so, here's a refresher, as I'll be using these on more than one occasion. So some important factors when we consider the housing crisis, its history in the United States is systemic racism, which I defined here as institutionalized forms of historic and current white supremacy that oppress racial minorities and disproportionately target their human rights or deny them essential services like healthcare and housing. Environmental racism is the manners in which racial minorities in their neighborhoods and communities are more likely to become victims to environmental toxins or neighbor industrial pollutants or price gouge necessities like water. Gentrification is also the ushering in of high-income individuals into an area that displaces the poor with high property value. And redlining is the denial of financial assistance services such as loans or insurance that profiles based on neighborhoods considered to be financially poor or at risk, especially in racial minority communities. Another definition that I'll be touching on is mutual aid, the voluntary reciprocal relief and support network set up by communities for those that may not be receiving the assistance they need from the government and may be difficult to reach as the elderly or disabled, usually by exchanging resources and services. So when contextualizing the history of the United States housing crisis, we really begin to see kind of the big transition from the demographics that are most impacted around the 1920s and 30s. But housing and homelessness first became a major issue around the 1870s. The Industrial Revolution was the catalyst transition from surviving and living on farms and agricultural work to depending on one's employment as their source of housing. People unemployed that could not find regular or reliable housing often took shelter in city police departments. Largely, the homeless were hidden often in plain sight in the major developing cities like New York and later Los Angeles, but were mainly orphan children and single, unemployed white men, though this would change over time. Depicted here is a photo of some of the few lodging house reading rooms that acted as a temporary housing for the impoverished, but was later replaced and often ushered out of the major cities as it became more profitable to replace and repurpose those buildings than it was to necessarily employ the poor that lived there. So by World War II, with a newly invigorated domestic workforce, housing was not tied to employment the way it was in the 19th century, but homelessness during this time remains difficult to track as the homeless and vagabond population continued to age with very little data on how many eventually established a long-term shelter, if at all, while some did retain some short-term housing, though dependent on social safety nets to do so, making homelessness during this time very difficult to define. Urban sprawl and the baby boom led to suburbanization in the 1950s and 60s, to a point that researchers at the time believed homelessness might practically vanish in the United States. But now the homeless were disproportionately marginalized racial minorities that were pushed out of suburban sprawl by racial segregation and unequal infrastructure, leading to many women and families that were increasingly at risk for substance abuse and mental illness. So by the 1980s, a new economic recession redefined the homeless population in a newly suburbanized America. Gentrification of the inner cities during budget cuts to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as the HIV/AIDS epidemic during this time, led to rents near the major cities skyrocketing while wages remained stagnant. While unemployment rose, cuts to subsidized housing and mental health institutions led to the modern condition of homelessness that we're most familiar with today. While some homeless services were reestablished during this time, such as soup kitchens and temporary shelters, homelessness remained relatively high without the causes of homelessness being addressed systemically or remediated. Discriminatory real estate and housing practices continued well into the 90s and 2000s, such as redlining and gentrification. During the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, which was when banks gave out too many unqualified mortgages, leading to mass defaults on subprime loans while housing prices rose, about 1.5 million people used temporary housing assistance, while about 44% of those homeless were unemployed. So we consider this and contextualize it to understand the material conditions we have now. We want to consider who might be responsible for the housing crisis, if anyone, and then more importantly, who are the homeless. So in 2019, there were about 500,000 people that were recognized as homeless or relying on temporary shelter. 19% were children under the age of 18, 40% were African American, 10 to 40% of all homeless youth are LGBT, 22% were Hispanic, and about 11% of the adult homeless population were veterans. So when we consider causes of homelessness, we will touch on this in various angles about what types of factors lead to vacant properties, what makes housing inaccessible in tourist areas for locals. So in this context, that would be investors, corporations, and banks that buy out vacant properties, landlords in tourist areas that do not rent out to local residents, gentrification causing rises in rent and driving out poor families and individuals, Another statistic to bear in mind in the context of this is that nearly 1 million evictions have occurred every year since 2000, as well as some states buying up property for construction or development projects that never occur, particularly in California. Now, homelessness continues to be impacted by intersectional issues on race and gender identity. Disproportionately targeted minorities face scrutiny in the judicial system for petty drug offenses in the US war on drugs. During this time, a majority of people in county jail for minor offenses are awaiting a bill they cannot pay. It's often in these circumstances that during this time they cannot go to work and as a result often face eviction from their housing, leading to homelessness. In 2017, roughly 2.3 million evictions were filed in the US, and that's a rate of about 4 new evictions every minute. So with the majority of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, about 49%, the average person is one missed paycheck away from poverty and therefore at risk of homelessness. So a global pandemic like coronavirus is continuing to disproportionately impact marginalized communities that are immunocompromised by environmental racism and housing discrimination, those that are disproportionately already most likely to be homeless. We come to a point in analyzing data where there are significantly more vacant properties than there are those that are homeless. So when we consider versus the 500,000 homeless, about how many vacant properties are in the United States, as of 2018, there's roughly about 17 million vacant properties. So why so many vacant properties? Why aren't these properties being repurposed for public housing? Well, a lot of vacant properties are utilized as financial investments by the wealthy that buy them out as speculation on what the neighborhood will look like in a few years, many of which are often luxury buildings, and this often includes condominiums opened by corporations and banks. Ways we can counteract vacancies are by enforcing a vacant property tax on those owners of unused buildings to drive down vacancies, but we'll touch on that later. So states like California and Pennsylvania during this pandemic, have faced homeless families seizing vacant property from the state to quarantine in. Some states like Washington have extended a moratorium on evictions during this pandemic, but many impacted by the pandemic's economic impact have organized rent strikes in their local areas in states that have inconsistent or non-existent financial support for the unemployed during this unprecedented time. So given the risk of coronavirus extending well into the coming months and possibly years, with some estimates leading up to as late as 2021 to 2022. This moment in history could prove as a time where we are forced to reevaluate how we treat the poor and how we address homelessness. So by establishing economic rights, not just out of concern for the public health, but for the greater good of the working class in America. If we do not do so, especially now, we come at the risk of complicity in mass deaths of the poor and the working class. The way we treat and think about the homeless has led to the conditions we are in during COVID-19, where the homeless cannot, at the very least, quarantine themselves safely somewhere, leading to more people being infected, and with the majority of the homeless being composed of those that have historically been victims of environmental racism and segregation, already being immunocompromised, they're more vulnerable to get infected and therefore to spread it more easily than it already is. As a result, this pandemic could be technically a vehicle for positive change at the rudest awakening. So I want to touch on housing as a human right when we consider what alternatives are there to this situation and how can we change how we think about housing. So housing is recognized by the United Nations as an essential economic right, and it is not a new concept. For example, the United States former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed a Bill of Economic Rights that included a right to adequate housing, among other things like an adequate job. In order to combat not just the coronavirus pandemic, but also the homelessness, substance abuse, and mental health crises that occur in the United States, it is important to pass and enforce substantive gains to ensure housing for all. While housing is an intersectional issue where housing reform is most successful in conjunction with, for example, criminal justice reform, how we tailor housing reform can benefit the most disadvantaged. So according to the UN, Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the human right to adequate housing consists of security of tenure, availability of services, materials, and infrastructure, affordability, accessibility, habitability, location, and cultural adequacy. We'll touch on some of that, but primarily the possible reforms that I will propose and then that we can consider and analyze include the following that we are going to examine individually. So this includes universal basic income, expanding housing, particularly in rural areas, reclaiming or repurposing vacant properties and decarbonizing new public housing, as well as building new public housing, granting eminent domain to communities in the form of community land trusts, like those in areas of Austin, Texas, and Boston, Massachusetts, as well as expanding on public housing and establishing rent control. So I first want to touch on universal basic income. I'm going to define it really quickly. So this is the universal guarantee of a baseline income for each adult by the government to combat homelessness, poverty, starvation, as well as support, express and establish some financial support for the amount of time and energy that the household division of labor consumes. This idea has existed since the 1960s and was famously a component of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People campaign. Benefits of universal basic income could improve quality of life for those already dependent on social welfare, particularly those disabled, that are already increasingly subject to cuts over the years to services that they rely on, such as Social Security. Universal basic income is effectively being tested now in many countries, given the pandemic, but has been successful in provinces of Canada, and a similar provision has existed in Alaska for years now. UBI would likely be funded by income tax, a rise in carbon tax, in the transition to green energy. So I also want to touch on reclaiming vacant properties, what that might mean, as well as reducing vacant properties, decarbonizing new public housing, among other things. So reclaiming or reducing vacant properties, one of the most immediate ways that we can consider this is repurposing vacant land or property to green efforts like community gardens or farms, as well as imposing a vacant property tax on the wealthy that are buying out vacant housing, driving down the number of vacancies, and then returning some money to the cities or localities that they are in, as well as providing some foreclosure intervention counseling to those that are at risk of being evicted from or having their homes foreclosed. When I talk about new and decarbonized public housing, an important piece of legislation to keep in mind is the Faircloth Amendment. So in order to advance new public housing, it's important that we repeal the 1998 provision, which makes it illegal for the Department of Housing and Urban Development to fund public housing, an amendment that people don't already know about a lot. Another way that we can consider this is to increase funding to already existing federal housing programs, such as the Family Unification Program, the Fair Housing Program, project-based and mainstream voucher programs, among others. Decarbonizing homes is actually proven to be consistently either cost-neutral or cost-effective and cost-saving. Decarbonization of housing takes the form of on-site renewable energy, like solar energy, and the low-carbon electrification of home appliances. So what this typically means is that we are replacing natural gas or propane-dependent home appliances with low-carbon electrification. So this can include cooking, laundry, and home heating appliances, most typically, so that they are also now regulated by home energy management technologies, which is essentially smart technology, and depending on flexible end uses that will maintain energy efficiency by preheating or pre-cooling homes during peak activity times. Cost efficiencies of these services will ensure generally better infrastructure of housing and help transition us off of fossil fuels. And when banning homestay rentals, the most immediate example that comes to mind is Airbnb. This is the one we're all probably most familiar with. So homestay rentals like Airbnb in high tourist areas like Los Angeles and areas of Hawaii and then New York as well, unintentionally to the consumer, but they inevitably cause artificial scarcity, meaning that the prices of long-term rentals to locals in tourist attraction cities tend to go up significantly because the properties are used as short-term rentals for tourists by landlords that will not rent out to the local residents long-term that need it. These properties are often sitting vacant for weeks or months, if not years at a time. So, federal rent control is another proposal, excuse me, which poses a federal cap on rent increases, with some proposals in California and then at the federal level being proposed anywhere from 2 to 3%, as high as 5%. We also want to expand on and enforce tenants' rights, which is non-discrimination for low-income families, as well as protection from wrongful eviction, such as the self-eviction by a landlord. When we also consider addressing the lingering effects of 2008 and predatory lending, we also could, from a legislative perspective, consider what we can do. So civil asset forfeiture is typically a situation in which the definition that we're probably most familiar with is when something that belongs to you is seized by the state. This can apply in the same context for housing, in which any housing or housing developer can be, if they are found guilty of housing discrimination practices, it can be repurposed into affordable housing by being taken back by the state. Credit score reform can also restore credit to victims of predatory lending like that in 2008. We can also better enforce transparency in lenders to prevent predatory lending. Community land trust networks are really interesting, and I want to touch on that quite a bit. So community land trust networks effectively are collective land ownership that really took off during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, particularly in countering gentrification. So I want to define two things really quickly before I proceed anymore. So eminent domain is the act of expropriating previously private property for public use. Land trusts have control of their own eminent domain because it keeps land away from developers that gentrify neighborhoods. And this is effectively the principle of community land trusts. They are a local nonprofit established to buy land for purposes of public goods, such as housing or gardening. What makes them so affordable is that the land trust buys the land the house is later built on, so when they lease to a homeowner, the payment is on a fixed rate. Community land trusts have really taken off in areas of East Austin, and an example I include here is the Dudley Neighborhood Street Initiative in Boston, Massachusetts, that later used it to develop green spaces and gardening for their local community. So what can I do in my community during COVID-19? Well, this is important to bear in mind since this will be a massive opportunity to reevaluate a lot of things about how our society is choosing to function. But in the context of the poor and the homeless, the main thing is to stay home if you can, if you're not an essential worker working for an essential business, as well as to maintain social distancing in a mutual aid network. And as previously defined, a mutual aid network is the process of giving reciprocal resources and services to those that are especially in need in your community. This could simply be providing emotional support from a social distance, or providing and giving some sort of assistance, such as groceries, to those that do not have access to transportation, such as the elderly or the disabled. You can later, but not right now, instigate property law reform in your local town. Some hospitals are still accepting donations of blood because they're anticipating a shortage coming in the coming weeks, given social distancing and also how many people will eventually need it. You can volunteer virtually, as said, for emotional support. And then later you can expand shelter for those in need in your town, such as in churches or in community centers. And then here's some of the works that I cited just for context of what research I was really pulling from. I had probably 50 articles and resources that I used, but they wouldn't all fit here. So I open the floor now that my presentation is effectively done and I've made my case to any questions you guys might have. So is there any interesting observation or question that we want to consider in the context of this?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. You did a great job. Definitely learned a whole lot of information that I wasn't aware of before. You really took a really deep dive into homelessness, the history of it, and everything that we're seeing today, and really connecting it really well with COVID-19. So yeah, right now, anyone who's still on this call, please put some questions in the chat so we can get some more knowledge from Jessica here about this issue. I'll start us off with a question, just to hopefully get us going. I'm wondering, Jessica, when you're looking at homelessness, right? And let's say let's say I'm a person that I don't care if someone's homeless or not, necessarily. And what would motivate me more would be like my self-interest. So when I'm thinking about COVID-19 and people being homeless, how could that impact me if people are homeless during COVID-19? Like, why should I care if I only cared about my self-interest?
If one only cared about their self-interest, it is important to bear in mind that this does, or at least can, eventually affect you. One important stat that I referenced earlier is that 49% of individuals are one paycheck away from homeless. So it is not only in the interests of others, but also in yours when we understand how precarious of a financial situation the majority of Americans are already in. If they aren't or haven't already been homeless in their lifetime, everyone is basically at a constant low risk of it occurring to them or someone they know or love.
All right, great, thank you. And looks like, oh, not a question, but someone just wanted to comment so that you did a great job and they learned a lot. So yes. So it looks like we're not going to have any other further questions for today. But everyone is putting their thanks for you in the chat right now. And again, thank you so much, Jessica. This is going to be recorded. We're going to have this up on our virtual Earth Month website link. So it's sustainability.tamu.edu. And you'll be able to find this recorded if you want to check it out later. And we have a bunch of cool events coming up. Jessica was the first student intern that was able to talk and give her first sustainability talk. Tomorrow we have a talk from Lauren Perez, and she's going to be talking about basically what's been going on with the environment and nature, and what has the absence of humans taught us is the title of her talk. So I think that one should be really interesting. That'll be at 2 p.m. And at 11:30, a little before that one, the Office of Sustainability, we're going to be having a virtual award ceremony where we're going to be recognizing some people on campus that are making our campus more sustainable. So we hope that you're able to join us for that. And without any further ado, again, thank you, Jessica. Great job today. And thanks everyone for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you on some further events that we have planned for the rest of the next 2 weeks. So thanks everyone and take care.